wind was a living thing that night, a relentless icy wolf clawing at the hills of Texas. It howled and tore at the desolate landscape, driving snow horizontally across the hard ground and piling it into unforgiving drifts against the cabin of Ezekiel Vaughn. The sun had vanished early, swallowed by a sky the color of old ash. There was no moon, no stars, only the sound of a primal force brushing through the trees, the groaning of stressed wood joints, and the quiet, steady rhythm of Ezekiel's own heartbeat. He woke suddenly, a sharp, unnatural jolt that sent a tremor of adrenaline through his system. It was the kind of wakefulness that came from years of sleeping with one ear cocked to the world, the kind that made a man's fingers twitch near his rifle before his eyes even had a chance to open. His old knee, shattered years ago by a falling tree limb, throbbed with a dull, deep ache that radiated up his thigh, a constant reminder of all he had lost. He sat up slowly on his cot, blinking into the dimness. The cabin wasn't dark. That was wrong. He remembered letting the fire die down before he had lain back, intending to leave the coals to their fate. But instead, a warm, steady light flickered on the log walls. A flicker of movement caught his eye. There was someone in front of the hearth. Not a ghost, not an animal, but a woman. Ezekiel's hand slid toward the Henry rifle, leaning against the side of his bed. He didn't grip it yet, just rested his calloused fingers on the cold wood stock, his thumb resting on the lever. He watched her. She was crouched low, her legs folded underneath her, wrapped in his heavy blanket, the one he kept beside the fireplace for the worst of the cold. Her hands were held out to the flames as if she didn't quite believe they would warm her. Her hair was wet dark and stuck to her shoulders. Her skin gleamed either from sweat or melted snow. Her feet were bare, swollen, and a mottled, angry red. He didn't move. His mind, accustomed to a life of slow, deliberate work, felt like it was still dragging itself from the depths of sleep. But the facts came to him one by one, cold and clear as the air outside. She had entered without waking him. She had rekindled the fire, taken his blanket. His bread was gone too. Crumbs still clung to the corner of her mouth. He noticed her youth, not a girl but a woman somewhere in her early 20s. Her face was hollowed at the cheeks but not wasted. Her arms had a lean, wiry strength. There was muscle under the dirt and exhaustion. She wore a deerskin dress, the kind he'd seen on Kiowa women before. The neckline hung low, the stitching pulled loose, exposing the delicate line of a collarbone and a hint of a firm chest. One side seam was torn higher, revealing the outer curve of her hip and thigh. Not intentionally, just a casualty of the cold and the miles she had walked. Ezekiel leaned forward slowly. The cot creaked under his weight, a betraying sound in the deep silence. At the noise, she turned. For a second, they simply stared at each other, both completely still, frozen in a silent tableau. His hand remained on the rifle. Her eyes, dark and sharp, flicked to it. Then she spoke, her voice low and raspy, a fragile sound broken by thirst. I thought the place was empty." Ezekiel didn't reply. He stood up carefully, putting all his weight on his good leg first, and letting the injured one drag a little. She didn't back away. Her gaze stayed locked on his, direct and unblinking. "I saw the chimney smoke," she said. I waited. Hours, maybe. Didn't see no one. I thought." She trailed off, her words hanging in the air. He could see she was weighing her words, her mind calculating every possibility. She wasn't scared. Not yet. She was too exhausted for that. The fear would come later, when the raw, immediate need for survival had passed. Ezekiel reached the stove, his boot toe pushing the iron kettle. It was still warm, a soft hum of heat coming from it. He poured the remaining water into a tin mug, set it on the small table, and looked at her. "You want to sit at the table like a person." His voice was a low rumble, worn smooth by years of disuse. She hesitated, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, then stood. Her movements were stiff, her body protesting the shift from cold to warmth. She limped slightly, as if her left foot had gone numb from exposure. As she sank into the chair opposite him, he took a better look at her face. High cheekbones, a strong, clean jawline. Her nose was red from the cold, but her eyes were dark and sharp, too alert for someone so near to freezing. She sat without ceremony, without apology, just a quiet acceptance of necessity. He slid the mug to her. She took it with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She didn't thank him, just drank slowly, the steam rising around her face. Inch by inch, her shoulders began to lower. It was as if her body had finally registered that she wasn't going to be shot, wasn't going to be thrown back out. "You got a name?" he asked. "Leora." He nodded once. "Ezekiel." He didn't say anything more. Neither did she. He looked toward the door. Snow had been tracked and melting in patches near the hearth. Her path was clear. She must have been watching him from the tree line for hours, waiting to be sure the cabin was empty before breaking in. "Where'd you come from?" She kept her eyes on the mug. "North. Walked." She swallowed the motion, painful. "My people scattered. After the raids. Some went to Indian territory. Some didn't make it. I stayed with a man for a time. Then he didn't want me anymore. Said I was too much trouble." Ezekiel didn't ask what kind of trouble. He'd seen enough of the world to know what it was. It was either another man's jealousy or just plain cruelty. Either way, she'd been on her own for days, maybe weeks. Her skin was dry and places chapped. Her legs bore faint cuts and bruises. She set the mug down and looked him straight in the eye. "I can cook," she said, her voice firm and devoid of emotion. "I can patch clothes, cut wood. I can warm your bed if you want. I can bear children. I'm strong." Her words weren't an offer of seduction. They were an offer of trade. A body and labor for shelter and survival. Ezekiel didn't speak. He just held her gaze, a man used to assessing animals and storms, now faced with a woman offering herself up as a commodity. "I'm not asking for pity," she added, her eyes flashing with a spark of fire. "Just don't send me back out there." He let out a slow breath, the sound barely audible in the quiet cabin. He stepped back toward the fire and picked up a second blanket. He held it out to her. She blinked, a flicker of something he couldn't name, hope, disbelief, relief passing over her face. "You'll sleep near the fire," he said, his voice low and final. "You're not going back out there, but you're not getting in my bed either." For the first time, her lip trembled just once, and the fierce guard in her eyes softened. A wave of profound relief washed over her features. She stood again, moving slower now, taking the blanket and wrapping it around herself. Then she knelt where she had been before, her movements no longer stiff, but with a quiet exhaustion that came with safety. She looked smaller that way, but steadier. Her eyes stayed on him even as she lay down. Ezekiel returned to his bed, sitting on the edge. His leg ached again, a sharp, angry throb. He didn't look at her, just stared at the floor. This was not how he wanted his night to go, but a part of him knew with an unshakable certainty that if he had thrown her out, he would never have slept again. He'd have seen her eyes all night. She hadn't cried, hadn't begged. He'd seen what it looked like when someone gave up. This woman hadn't. She had simply stood a beacon of defiant resilience in a world that had tried to crush her. When he finally lay down, he kept the rifle near just in case. Not because he thought she meant him harm, but because he didn't yet know how to stop guarding himself. She curled under the blankets near the fire, a small dark shape in the dancing light. Her breathing slowed. The unspoken rhythm. When Ezekiel woke the next morning, the light coming through the frosted window was a weak gray smear. The fire had burned down to embers, and his knee ached with the relentless cold. He sat up slowly, scanning the room by instinct before his mind had fully caught up. She was still there. Leora lay on her side near the hearth, wrapped in both blankets, one arm tucked under her head. Her breathing was even and slow. The sharp tension from the night before had softened in her sleep, but her brow was still furrowed. She hadn't fully let go. He'd seen that in soldiers too. People who never got rest, only pauses. Ezekiel stood and moved toward the stove. The floorboards creaked under his weight. Her eyes opened, instantly alert, but she didn't startle. She simply watched him as he knelt to stir the coals and toss in another log. Her arms tightened under the blanket, pulling it up to her chin. The fire caught quickly, flames licking up the bark. He broke the silence. "You didn't run." "I noticed," he replied, placing the kettle on the stovetop. He poured oats into a small pot, added water. The only sound was the popping of the fire. The wind outside had died down, but the frost still clung to the windows. "You said you can cook." "I can," she said. He stepped aside. She sat up, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and came over barefoot. She took the spoon from his hand, stirred the oats as if it were a routine she had performed 1,000 times. She wasn't graceful, but she knew what she was doing. Ezekiel stepped back and leaned against the wall, watching her. She moved slowly, methodically, still wary. "Where exactly were you before this?" She kept her eyes on the pot. "A man named Apprentice. White man. Took me after the raids. Said I was his woman. I never agreed to that. I just didn't fight it." "What happened?" She looked up then, her eyes meeting his. "He traded me off. Said I owed him too much. Said I was too much trouble. Got tired of hiding me. Traded me to a trapper near the Brazos." She gave a slight shrug, not casual but resigned. "Didn't stay long there either. Then I walked. A few days. I don't know how many." He watched her closely. Her hands moved with a quiet, practiced confidence as she stirred the oats. He could see the bruises now, the ones he hadn't noticed the night before. One along her wrist, another darker one near her shoulder where the dress gaped. She pulled the blanket higher, sensing his eyes on her. "You said your people scattered after the blue coat raids last spring. Some taken, some fled, some died," she confirmed. "Why not follow them?" "I was tired of running," she said, her voice a whisper of exhaustion. "Just tired of running." He nodded once. He understood that more than he cared to admit. She ladled the oats into 2 tin bowls and handed him one. He didn't thank her. He just took it and sat down at the table. She joined him after a moment, still wrapped in both blankets. Her hair was tangled and drying, and her dress was still damp in patches. They ate in silence. The warmth filled the room slowly. When they were finished, she cleaned both bowls and rinsed them in the basin without being asked. It wasn't for show. It was instinct. Ezekiel spoke as she dried her hands. "This isn't charity." Leora turned around slowly. "I didn't ask for charity. If you stay here, it's work," he continued. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing. You don't owe me anything else." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You mean I don't have to lie with you?" "That's right." She didn't answer right away. "But if I wanted to." Ezekiel's face stayed neutral, but a flicker of something. A memory, a phantom ache of loneliness passed behind his eyes. "That's not the kind of thing you owe anyone," he said, his voice flat and steady. "Even if you think you do. You sleep here. You eat here. That's the deal. The rest is your decision." Leora nodded a quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't gratitude on her face. It was something harder to name. Maybe the beginning of trust. Or maybe just an understanding that for the first time in a very long time she was being given a choice. He stepped toward the door, pulled on his coat, and looked back at her. "Stay inside today. Cold's still bad. I'll check the cattle. You trust me in here?" "No," he said, a ghost of a smirk on his lips. "But I trust I'll know if you touch what you shouldn't." She gave a single dry laugh. Then she pulled the blanket tighter and moved to the fire. Ezekiel stepped outside, his breath fogging instantly in the bitter air. The snow had frozen stiff across the ground, hard-packed by the wind. He walked slowly toward the shed, his limp more visible with the cold stiffening his leg. As he reached the corral, he caught himself thinking of her again. She hadn't cried. Not once. She hadn't begged. And when he'd offered shelter, she hadn't tried to sweeten the deal. She was here for survival. But maybe not only that. The space between them. By the third morning, the rhythm between them had shifted. Not softened, not settled, but a cautious understanding had been forged. The cabin no longer held the sharp tension of an intrusion. It was quiet now in a different way. Not empty, just no longer quite so desolate. Ezekiel woke to the sound of the fire already burning. The smell of coffee drifted faintly through the room. Leora sat at the table, still in the same deerskin dress, now dry but stiff from repeated wear. Her long dark hair had been brushed out with one of his old combs, which she had found without asking. There was a fresh bandage on her foot where the skin had split from walking on frozen earth barefoot. He had noticed her wrap it with a piece of cloth she found in a drawer. She didn't try to hide the injury, and he didn't ask about it. He sat down without a word. She poured him coffee. He drank it, then finally spoke. "That dress needs mending more than my shirts do." She looked up at him over the rim of her own cup. "You have a spare shirt I can use?" He nodded, once stood and pulled one from a crate beneath his cot. It was older, a little loose in the collar, but still clean. He tossed it onto the table. "Cut it if you have to." Leora took the shirt in both hands, her thumb running along the collar. She didn't move right away. She just looked at the fabric. Then she swallowed, and for the first time since she had arrived, turned her back to him and let the blanket drop. She began untying the straps of the deerskin dress, careful and slow. Ezekiel didn't watch. He stood and walked to the window facing the frost-covered glass. He could hear the soft rustle of hide, the quiet movements behind him, the faint hiss when the damp fabric pulled a healing bruise. He didn't turn around until he heard the sound of his shirt being pulled over her head. When he did, she was already adjusting the sleeves, rolling them at the wrists. The shirt hung low on her, just past her hips. It wasn't proper, not by town standards, but it was warm and it was his. She caught him looking. Neither of them said a word. Leora folded her dress neatly, setting it near the fire to dry more. Then she sat back down and picked up the needle again, resuming stitching the torn elbow of one of his coats. The same movement she'd started the day before. Her hands didn't shake anymore. They moved with a quiet steadiness as if she belonged to this space now, even if only halfway. He finally spoke again. "That trapper you mentioned, he hurt you." She paused, finished the stitch she was in the middle of, then looked up. "No, but he would have. He was waiting for me to be too weak to say no." Ezekiel's jaw tensed. "And the one before him, apprentice?" She didn't answer right away. "He called me woman in front of others, but in private I was something else. Quiet and useful." Her fingers resumed sewing. "When I asked to leave, he said he'd sell me for a blanket and a tin of beans. I guess I wasn't worth more." Ezekiel looked down at his own hands, scarred knuckles, bone marks on the back of his left from the forge he'd kept before giving it up. He wasn't a man made for talking. He never had been. But there was something in her story that didn't sit right in silence. "You're worth more," he said flatly, his voice gruff. She looked up again, her eyes searching his. "Why?" "Because you're still standing." They didn't talk for a while after that. Outside, the wind had started again. The frost on the window grew thicker. The cattle would need more feed before nightfall. Ezekiel stood and began pulling on his coat. "You don't have to stay," he said without looking at her. "If you ever want to go, I won't stop you." She stood too. "You want me gone? Number. Then I'll stay." That was it. No vows, no promises, just survival, stated plainly. Later, while Ezekiel was out hauling feed, Leora began cleaning the cabin. She swept the dirt and snow into a pile by the door. She scrubbed the basin and sorted the few supplies there were. She found an old photograph wedged in a drawer, faded and bent at the edges. A woman with kind eyes and a baby swaddled in a blanket. Both long gone. She didn't ask who they were. She placed the photo back exactly where she had found it. That night after supper, Leora sat near the fire, her legs tucked under her, the shirt loose on her shoulders. Her skin looked warmer now, less gray. The bruises had begun to yellow. Ezekiel sat in his usual chair, sipping slowly from the same tin cup he always used. He spoke again before the fire died down. "You scared me that first night." She looked over, surprised. "I did. Didn't expect to find someone inside my walls. Thought maybe I'd gone soft." "You haven't." He watched her carefully. "You look different now." She raised a brow. "Cleaner." "No," he said. "Like you expect to wake up tomorrow." That made her pause. The silence stretched. "I do," she finally said. She moved to lay the blankets out as she had each night. But this time, when she knelt down by the hearth, she hesitated. She turned to look back at him. "You said the rest is my choice." He met her eyes. "Tonight I'll stay near the fire," she said. "But maybe not always." Ezekiel didn't answer. He just nodded once and stood to fetch another log for the fire. And for the first time since his wife had passed, a quiet dread he hadn't known he was carrying began to lift. Chosen closeness. By the end of the fourth day, the storm had sealed them in. The wind pressed harder than ever against the cabin wall, sending loose snow hissing through cracks in the doorframe. The drifts outside had risen to the window panes and the roof groaned under the weight of ice. Ezekiel didn't leave the property. There was no point. The cattle were pinned in tight. Feed had already been dragged in. There was enough wood stacked by the door to last through the week if the weather didn't turn worse. Inside, everything was quiet, but nothing felt still. Leora moved differently now. Not cautious like before, not exactly comfortable either, just settled. She swept the floor with short, purposeful strokes, her wrapped foot making the smallest shuffling sound. The shirt she wore, his old one, had been cinched around her waist with a strip of leather she'd cut from a damaged saddle strap. It fit her better now, covered what needed covering and revealed what didn't mind being seen. Ezekiel noticed more than he let on. He was near the window, sharpening a knife with steady passes of the wet stone the same way he had every winter before. But this time his attention wandered. She bent to pick up a pot, and the shirt's hem lifted, showing the long, graceful curve of a thigh where her dress had once covered. He looked away too late. She caught him. Her eyes met his direct, not flirtatious, not shy, just aware. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Later, after supper, she sat by the fire, combing her hair again. She'd used the pine soap he had stashed under the wash basin, and her skin smelled cleaner now, less like smoke and more like something alive. Her bare legs were folded under her, the heat from the flames painting her in golden shadow. Ezekiel watched from his chair, one hand resting over his knee. "You were married once," she said suddenly, a statement rather than a question. He nodded. "Long time ago." "What happened?" "Fever took her. A winter like this one. And the baby." He glanced at the fire, his jaw shifting slightly before he spoke. Lived 6 days. Leora said nothing for a while. Then you built all this yourself. Every plank. He hesitated. Wasn't meant to be for one person. You still don't want one, she said quietly. Ezekiel looked at her now. She didn't look away. He could see the truth in her eyes. I didn't think I could want again, he said. Not in that way. Her voice was a soft whisper. And now, Ezekiel stood slowly, limping slightly as he walked to the hearth. He knelt beside the fire and added another log. The flames jumped higher. He stayed there, crouched, his elbows on his knees. I don't know what to do with someone like you, he said. What does that mean? You're here, but I don't own you. You offer yourself, but not for pity. You work like it's your place, but you haven't asked to stay. Leora leaned forward, her voice low and steady. Because I was waiting to see if you wanted me to. Ezekiel looked at her again, closer now, only a foot away. Her face was soft with the heat, her eyes steady with no fear in them, just something weightier, something held back. He reached out and brushed his fingers across her jaw just once. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch barely, like instinct. His hand dropped. I don't want to touch you just because I can, he said, his voice a low, gravelly confession. Then don't touch me unless you need to. Ezekiel's fingers flexed at his side. His body was a storm of heat and hesitation. You keep saying you'll stay, he said. But what are you staying for? Leora shifted forward just slightly, close enough for her knee to touch his. You gave me warmth when I didn't earn it. You fed me without asking what I'd give back. You told me I was worth something. She paused, her voice a fragile admission. That's more than any man's done. He nodded, his voice low. That's not love. No, she said. But it's closer than the fire. They sat there a moment, too close for the silence to feel safe. Then Ezekiel stood slowly, backing up before he acted on what his body wanted. He turned his back and walked to the cot. You take the bed tonight, he said without turning around. I'll stay near the fire. Leora stood slowly, unsure. He glanced back. It's warm. And it's yours now. You need real sleep. She nodded. All right. That night she lay under his quilt, curled on his side of the bed, inhaling the scent of pine smoke and man. Ezekiel sat beside the fire, his back to her, sharpening a second blade, but the wet stone never once touched steel. His hands just rested there still. Neither of them slept early, and both of them silently began thinking in terms of we, the promise of tomorrow. The cold didn't break. If anything, it deepened. Daylight came and went with little distinction, the sky outside a muted white as if the sun had been swallowed whole. Snow stacked against the corners of the cabin in silent mounds. The wind dropped some nights, but the frost never left. Inside, the routine became a silent, shared pact of survival. Ezekiel took to waking first, checking the fire and feeding the cattle if the weather allowed. Leora cooked with what little they had, hard bread softened with heat stews from salted meat, bits of root vegetables he'd stored months ago. She moved comfortably now. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore, just familiar. But neither of them said what they were both beginning to feel until the fifth night. It was colder than the rest. The wind howled louder. The cabin creaked its joints, straining under the freeze. Ezekiel had gone out that afternoon to break ice at the trough. By the time he came in, his hands were stiff and red, his beard rimmed with frost. Leora moved quickly when she saw him. She pulled his coat off, reached for a cloth, and pressed it into his hands to warm his fingers. You shouldn't have gone out alone. They'd have died otherwise. You could have died too. He didn't answer, just stood there breathing hard, the heat of the fire not reaching him yet. Sit, she said, not asking but commanding. He sat near the fire. She knelt in front of him, unbuckled his boots, and slowly pulled them off with care. His socks were damp. She replaced them with a dry pair without a word, then rubbed his hands between hers, trying to bring them back to life. His skin was rough, calloused, and cold to the bone. Her touch was steady, firm, not gentle but intimate in its care. He watched her. You didn't have to do all that, he said, his voice raw with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. You didn't have to save me either. Ezekiel let out a slow breath. His voice was lower now, a confession he hadn't known he needed to make. I wasn't trying to be kind. I just couldn't stand the thought of someone freezing that close to my door. Her eyes flicked up to his. Maybe it doesn't matter why you did it. He didn't answer, but his hands didn't pull away. Later, after supper, they sat on the floor near the fire, closer than usual. Leora wore the same cinched shirt now laid over thick wool leggings he'd found for her in the storage trunk. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, still damp from washing. Ezekiel leaned back against the leg of the chair, a blanket draped over both of them. They hadn't touched all day until now. Leora shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his. Then her hand rested lightly on his. She didn't grip, just placed it there, her fingers warm and light. Ezekiel didn't move for a long time. Then he turned his palm upward and held her hand. They sat like that for minutes, maybe longer, the silence between them a full living presence. Then she spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Go on." "That picture I found, the woman and the baby. That was your wife Sarah and Daniel. They looked happy." "They were," he said, his voice a ghost of a memory. "For a little while." Leora nodded. "Did you ever think about starting again?" "I used to think I couldn't. That I didn't deserve to. And now." He looked at her, his eyes sharp but quiet. "Now I don't know what I deserve. But I know what I want." She didn't speak. She just leaned forward slow, giving him every chance to back away. He didn't. Their lips met soft, and searching at first, then deeper. He pulled her closer, his hand sliding to her waist, feeling the firmness of her body beneath the shirt. Her fingers touched his face, brushed the scar that ran along his temple. He let her. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't desperate. It was the first touch that meant something. When they finally broke apart, they didn't say anything. There were no questions, no labels, just breath, just warmth. That night she didn't ask permission. When she rose from the fire and walked toward the bed, she paused, once looked back at him. He followed. And for the first time in years, Ezekiel Vaughn didn't sleep alone. A shared life. A shared future. The sun didn't rise, not fully, just a dull gray light that slipped between the frost-laced window panes. Outside the wind had died, but the cold hadn't. Snow still blanketed everything beyond the cabin walls. But inside something had shifted. Ezekiel stirred first. He didn't sit up right away, just blinked against the gray light and stared at the ceiling, one arm still resting over the warmth beside him. Leora lay curled against his side, one hand resting lightly on his chest, her head tucked under his jaw, her hair spilled across the wool blanket. Her breathing was soft and even. He hadn't moved much in the night. Neither had she. He turned his head slightly enough to look down at her. The sight didn't shock him. It didn't feel strange. It felt settled, as if she belonged there. He stayed that way a few minutes longer, then slowly shifted, pulling his arm out from beneath her. She murmured something half asleep, barely audible, but didn't wake. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulled on his long shirt, and limped quietly toward the stove. The fire had burned low again. He added 2 logs, watched them catch, then stood in silence, rubbing the stiffness from his bad leg. Behind him, he heard the blanket shift. She sat up slowly, keeping the quilt wrapped around her, one hand holding the front closed. Her hair was tousled, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Did I snore?" she asked. Ezekiel smirked faintly without turning. "No worse than me." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I didn't think I'd sleep that well again. You needed it." She stood still, wrapped in the covers, and walked barefoot to the fire. He stepped back to give her space. She crouched in front of the stove, letting the warmth touch her face. He looked at her, at the red mark still faint on her shoulder where her dress strap had dug in days before. At the small scar on her thigh. The shape of a body under the blanket was familiar now. Known. Still, he didn't touch her. "Not yet." Leora turned slightly toward him. "You regret it?" "No," Ezekiel said. "Good," she replied, a quiet triumph in her voice. "Because I don't either." He handed her a shirt from the chair, one of his better ones. She took it, looked at it for a moment. "Is this a sign of something?" she asked, quiet and vulnerable. "It's a shirt," he said, then shrugged. "It's the shirt I'd give someone if I wanted them to stay." Her expression softened. "Then I'll wear it." As she dressed behind the curtain, drawn only halfway across the cabin, Ezekiel ladled hot water into the basin and splashed his face. His hands were raw from the cold, cracked at the knuckles, but the sharp burn of the warm water grounded him. He looked up at the mirror nailed to the wall. His reflection was older than he remembered. Gray in the beard, that scar still as deep as it ever was. But his eyes, they weren't hollow. He turned when she stepped out. The shirt hung just right on her, now buttoned halfway up sleeves, rolled her hair tied loosely with a strip of leather. She looked like someone who had been there for months, maybe longer. They ate in silence, bread dipped in broth, coffee black and hot. Halfway through the meal she asked, "Do people come here? Anyone ever visit?" "Not in winter. Sometimes a trader rides through come spring. I don't go into town unless I need something real bad." She hesitated. "Would they care that I'm here?" Ezekiel didn't answer right away. "They'd look twice," he said. "Maybe talk behind their hands." "Because I'm Kiowa." He nodded. "Because I'm in your bed." He nodded again. She didn't seem surprised. Would you lie about me, she asked. No, he said firmly, not once. She studied him for a moment, and then a faint, true smile touched her lips. Then I'll stay. Later that day, they worked together to patch the barn's outer wall where a board had come loose. She held the nails. He hammered. When the cold bit too hard, they paused and warmed their hands against each other's skin, no longer afraid to be close. That night, when they lay down again, neither said anything. She pulled the quilt over them both. His arm came around her without thought, and in the dark, surrounded by snow and silence, the fear that had once clung to both of them had started to loosen its grip. They didn't talk about love. They didn't need to. They were still alive, still warm. And for the first time, they weren't surviving separately. The weight of a whisper. The snow had stopped, not melted, just paused. A stillness hung over the land outside the cabin like the breath before a word. The gray sky stretched low across the horizon, and the trees stood bare and stiff. But the wind had quieted, and for the first time in nearly a week, Ezekiel stepped outside without feeling like the air might kill him. He stood on the porch, his boots planted firm, his arms crossed against the cold. His coat hung open. The silence of the land wasn't empty. It was waiting. Something was shifting, and he felt it in his chest. Inside the cabin, Leora swept the hearth clean. She had braided her hair that morning the way Kiowa women did after morning had passed. No one had died, but something old in her heart had. The shirt she wore, his shirt, was now tucked into a pair of patched trousers she'd taken in herself. Her shape was different in the new clothes. Still curved, still strong, but less on display. She wasn't hiding. She was living. Ezekiel came back in with an armful of kindling and stamped the snow from his boots. She looked up when he entered, then bent back down to the hearth. The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, known. They hadn't spoken much since that night. Not because there was tension, but because there wasn't. What needed to be said had already been shown in hands and shared warmth in the way her legs tangled with his under the covers. But that morning something stirred differently between them. Ezekiel poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to her. She took it, their fingers brushing for a moment longer than necessary. She sat cupping it between both hands. Why did you really take me in, she asked. He didn't sit yet. He leaned against the wall and thought about it. Because I couldn't forget your face if I turned you away, he said. And I didn't want to live with that. She looked up at him, studying the lines in his face. That night, she said, when I told you I could cook bear children, all of it, I meant it like a bargain. I thought you'd want something for what you gave. I didn't, he said. I know that now. But I still needed to say it. Ezekiel set his mug down and sat across from her. I didn't want anyone in my life again. Not after Sarah. Not after the baby. I'd already decided to finish out what time I had left with cattle whiskey and cold air. Leora nodded. You were ready to be buried in silence. Something like that. She tilted her head. And now, he reached across the table and took her hand. Now there's you. She squeezed his fingers gently. I don't know what this is yet, she said. I only know I don't want to leave. And I don't want to be just a body you share a bed with. You're not, he said. You never were. They sat that way a long time, their hands joined the coffee cooling on the table. Later, they worked together to patch a crack in the cabin wall near the window. Leora held a board in place while Ezekiel hammered. When the hammer slipped and caught his thumb, he cursed under his breath, and she smirked. You talk more now, she said. I used to talk too much when I drank, he replied. Now I've got a better reason. She looked at him sideways. You're saying I replaced whiskey. You're warmer and quieter. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard it full and unguarded. The sound settled somewhere deep in him. That evening, just after dusk, a distant sound caught their attention. A coyote's cry. Ezekiel stood at the door, rifle in hand. Leora joined him quietly. They listened together. It was far off. No threat. Still she spoke. What happens when spring comes? What do you mean? When people start coming through again. When the roads open. When they see me here, they'll talk, Ezekiel said. Might even spit in the dirt when I walk past. Will you care? He turned to her, his expression serious. Do you? She didn't hesitate. Number. Then neither do I. She stepped closer, pressed her palm against his chest. I don't need a name, Ezekiel. I don't need a ceremony. But I need to know I won't be hidden. His hand covered hers. I don't hide what matters. They stood there until the sky went black, and the wind picked up again. Inside that night, he didn't take her hand. She took his, pulled him to bed without speaking, and lay beside him, skin to skin. Under the heavy quilt, her breath against his neck, his arm wrapped around her waist. No vows, no promises, just staying. And that was enough. The last companion. The storm season finally broke. By late February, the snow began to soften, melting in heavy patches that slid from the roof and soaked into the hard ground. The air was still cold, but it carried a faint scent of earth now instead of only ice. The silence of winter loosened, and with it came the first signs of change. Ezekiel noticed it in the cattle, first their restlessness, the way they pawed at the ground as though testing it. He'd step outside each morning, his limp heavy from the cold, and see steam rising from their backs. Leora would watch him from the porch, his rifle slung across his back, his broad frame cutting against the pale light. She no longer stayed inside when he worked. She followed, held buckets, steadied fence posts, and mended what needed fixing without waiting to be asked. The routine between them had become seamless, but the unspoken weight of what lay beyond the cabin still lingered. He knew it. She knew it. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both thought it. When the roads cleared, others would come. Traders, ranchers, people from town. The silence of winter had protected them. Spring would not. That morning, as she spread a blanket near the fire to dry the shirt she'd washed, Leora paused. She turned to him. "When your people see me, they'll ask questions." Ezekiel sat sharpening a chisel at the table. He didn't look up at first. "They'll ask. And if they don't like the answers." He met her eyes, then steady and sure. "They'll have to live with them." She studied him for a long moment, gauging if that was truth or just defiance. Then she nodded and returned to her work. She didn't need a longer speech. Ezekiel had never been a man of them. His word, simple as it was, carried more weight than promises from others. Later, they carried feed together to the barn. Leora walked beside him, her breath rising in faint puffs of steam. She still wore his shirt belted at the waist, but now she layered it with a wool vest she'd altered to fit. Her hair was braided tight, a feather bound into it with a leather cord. She no longer looked like a woman who had stumbled barefoot into his cabin. She looked like someone who belonged to the land itself. Inside the barn, she leaned against a post while he checked the water trough. After a moment, she spoke again, her tone quiet, almost hesitant. "There's something I haven't told you." Ezekiel looked over. "Go on." "When I left Apprentice, I thought I might already be carrying." Her fingers tightened on the post, but her voice didn't waver. "My body bled it out." Ezekiel stood still, watching her carefully. "I thought maybe it meant I couldn't anymore," she said. "That no man would want a woman who failed." He set down the pail and stepped closer. His hand rested against her cheek, his thumb brushing the faint line of her jaw. "You didn't fail," he said, his voice a low, fierce whisper. "You survived." Emotion shook her, not with tears. She hadn't cried in front of him once, but with something harder to name. She nodded once, short and sharp, as though his words had settled something deep inside. That night after supper, the fire burned strong. They sat together on the cot, her back pressed to his chest, his arm around her waist. She reached for his hand and placed it low over her stomach. "If I do carry again," she whispered, "I want it to be yours." Ezekiel's grip tightened, gently steady, without hesitation. "Then it will be." They kissed slower this time. No rush, no desperation, just certainty. His hands held her face. Hers traced the scar along his temple. The quilt slipped from her shoulders. The closeness that followed wasn't born of fear or hunger. It was chosen. Both of them staying. Both of them giving. Both of them ready for what came next. By the time the fire burned low and the wind pressed soft against the walls, Leora was curled against him, asleep, steady breaths rising from her chest. Ezekiel lay awake a little longer, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for the silence to swallow him. He was waiting for the sound of another heartbeat. New life, new world. By March, the snow had thinned enough that wagon tracks began to cut through the flats. Birds returned first, their faint cries breaking the silence that had hung for months. The thawed creeks ran fuller again, and smoke from distant homesteads started to mark the horizon. The world was stirring after winter, and with it came the proof that they couldn't stay hidden forever. Ezekiel knew it when he saw the rider, a trader from Saddle Ridge, bundled heavy, his mule pulling a cart stacked with sacks of flour and tools. Ezekiel stepped outside to meet him while Leora stood just inside the door, arms folded. She didn't hide, though. She stood straight as the man gave Ezekiel a sharp look, then his eyes shifted to her in the doorway. She wore Ezekiel's shirt tied with leather, her braid hanging over one shoulder. She didn't flinch under the man's stare. She met it. "Didn't know you had company, Vaughn," the trader said. "I do now," Ezekiel replied flatly. The trader's brow arched. "Kiowa." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "She's Leora. That's all you need to know." The trader smirked but didn't press. He made his sale, traded flour for hides, and left before dusk. Ezekiel watched until the cart disappeared. When he stepped back inside, Leora was still by the fire, her arms crossed. "They'll talk," she said. "Let them," Ezekiel answered. That night they sat close on the cot, her legs drawn over his lap, his hand resting lightly against her stomach where she had pressed it before. She shifted his hand higher, then lower again, holding it there, her eyes lifted to meet his. "I was late," she whispered. He studied her face, not sure he'd heard right. She gave a small, firm nod. "I think I carry yours." Ezekiel didn't move for a long time. The weight of her words settled into him slowly. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with something heavier, something he hadn't felt since Sarah had told him of Daniel. Except this time he didn't feel dread. He felt alive. His hand stayed against her stomach. His voice came low, steady. "Then this is your home. Yours and the child's." Her lips parted, and for the first time he saw her fight the edge of tears. She pressed her forehead against his, her breath shaking. "I thought I would never belong anywhere again." "You belong here," he said, "with me." They kissed harder, this time not hesitant. His hand slid along her back, pulling her close. She clung to him, not as a woman desperate to survive, but as one who had chosen. The quilt slipped down again, and they lay together under it, the closeness no longer uncertain. Weeks passed, and the land grew warmer. The cattle-calved streams ran fuller. Leora's body began to change, subtle, but enough for Ezekiel to notice. He didn't say anything at first. He simply worked longer, cut more wood, set more traps, and stocked more supplies, preparing. One morning, as the sun finally broke through clouds that had held all winter, Ezekiel saddled his horse. Leora came to the door, her arms folded. "You're going to town," she said. He nodded. "They'll stare at me." "They'll stare at me too," he replied. She tilted her head. "You mean to tell them?" "No," he said. "I mean to show them." And so he did. In town, heads turned, men muttered under their breath. A few women whispered, but Ezekiel walked with Leora at his side, his hand resting firm at her back. When someone spat near the trough, Ezekiel turned and met the man's eyes until he looked away. Leora held her head high, her braid hanging down her shirt, cleaner figure showing the faintest swell of new life. By the time they returned home, the message was clear. She was his, and he was hers. That evening, as they sat on the porch, the land stretched quiet and endless before them. The sky burned orange over the hills. Leora leaned against him, her hand resting over his stomach again. Ezekiel's arm wrapped around her shoulders. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. "Neither are you," he said. They stayed that way until the light faded, the fire inside, waiting, the sound of cattle settling in the distance. Ezekiel Vaughn, who once thought silence would be his last companion, had a woman beside him, a child on the way, and a home no longer built for one. For the first time in years, he was ready to live. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.